So
Hold on, you may want to do, how do we do the presentation mode that?
No, Seth's not in, Seth's in some weird mode where he's in edit mode, or he's.
no, I'm in presentation mode. If you see me in edit mode, then something's wrong on my end, but I see it as presentation mode.
Seth, we're seeing, yeah, I think you've got
seeing
your
your slide.
preview slide on.
Oh, good gracious. All right. Let's see what happens if I do this. Hold on. I actually don't know how to solve that particular problem, but I do know how to make this regular mode into full screen. So does this solve the problem? Unless somebody can chime in and tell me how not to broadcast slide mode.
Can you just go to slideshow mode or view
Well,
presentation
that was what I
mode?
had before. So let's see what happens if I enter full screen. How about if I do that? How does that look?
This is fine. We're seeing, we're seeing your slide deck on the left-hand channel and but it's fine.
Really?
Just go.
Yeah, go with it.
All right. I wish I could see my slide deck. Then I'd know what was coming next. This is what happens when I use two monitors. And so we are,
So are you on a Mac?
I do. Yeah.
I think probably your display settings are set so that you're not video mirroring.
Wait, hold on a second. This is my favorite part of every talk.
All right.
Yeah. So if I go to desktop, hold on a second. Screen. Displays, there we go. Sorry, I need to figure out how to do video mirroring here.
You're good.
All right, just give me a moment.
Yeah, so he's got two monitors and it's
I
generally.
have two monitors. Yeah, that's exactly what the problem is.
Good thing. It's a good problem now.
You would hope so. Mirror. All right. Now let's see. How does it look now? Did we win or no?
We're seeing you.
You haven't shared the screen yet.
I have. Oh, I haven't shared. So, okay, hold on a second. You're probably right. Yeah. All right. There are too many choices here. Zoom.
Yes.
Zoom, share, Microsoft PowerPoint, share,
Yes.
PowerPoint.
Good enough.
Yeah.
Are you able to see your deck now? We're seeing your deck on. Oh, fuck.
You still are seeing the deck part and not the main part?
Now we're seeing the preview
We're
screen.
seeing both.
Wow.
We're seeing every.
All right, hold on a second. We're gonna try.
Well, if you keep.
If I keep. I'm mirrored.
Okay.
That's
If you
all right.
mirrored,
Well, all right, guys. You know what we're gonna do? We're gonna take away my good quality camera, and we're just gonna do this from the MacBook.
perfect.
All right. I am not going to be as pretty, but it's actually going to work when there's only one screen. So now we're going to zoom and we're going to share. And we're going to go to PowerPoint and it is going to work. Yes?
Yes.
Glenn.
Yes.
All right, that was the answer. Thanks, Seth.
Yeah, that was easy. All right. Well, just by removing technology, we're making things better. All right, guys. Thank y'all. So guys, there are about 1.5 billion cows in the world today. They occupy about 30% of the planet's habitable land, right? The purpose of a cow is to turn grass into meat, which in turn gets turned into money. It's to allow people to live in these lands. And now we may think about the cow as dinner, but the cow is also factory, which makes it a really interesting technology to analyze. So my name is Seth Miller. I am an independent consultant. I have my own company that I do primarily innovation consulting. So I work with companies to build cost models for technologies that don't exist, to help them identify and innovate new paths to get to market. And then sometimes also to analyze an industry and try to understand where the opportunities are for disruption. And today I'm going to talk about disruption, and I'm going to talk about how to analyze the potential for innovation. And I'm going to do it through the story of a cow. So fundamentally, all of the details are going to be cow related, but occasionally I'm going to go abstract and talk about what the framework is for analyzing disruption in the first place. And that's going to mean identifying the definition of a term that sort of gets bandied about in the popular press without ever defining it. Figuring out what kinds of problems it solves, and then, important from the Atlas perspective, trying to understand whether or not you can design disruption in the first place. So with that, I decided to go and investigate this story and tell the story, because as somebody who works in industry, when I'm working for a client, I don't get to share their stories. And so as a result, the stories of disruption here that I'm going to be telling is my own research. I wanted to be able to illustrate the tools that I use, and I wanted to do it about a topic that I cared something about, and that's saving the planet. The challenge with cows is when there are 1.5 billion of them occupying so much of the planet, is that we have a global warming problem with cows. The cows create an incredible footprint. And if you take a look at the environmental footprint of every sector of the economy, if you look at the global greenhouse gases emitted, for example, by transport on the left side of the screen, that would include passenger cars and trucks, or agriculture on the right side of the screen, which would include cows and corn, chickens and soy, all of the different products that we make. You'll see that globally, transport and agriculture are about the same size. Now, in the United States, transport is bigger because we have more cars than average, but globally, transport is not. Cars and trucks, personal cars and trucks make up about 10% of global greenhouse gases. And we put a lot of effort into thinking about how to make that green, how to take the internal combustion engine and replace it with batteries, replace it with an electric drivetrain. But we don't talk very much about how we might innovate in the agricultural sector. And it turns out that cows emit globally the same that cars do. So cows alone are responsible for 2/3 of agricultural emissions, and cows are responsible for 10% of total global emissions. So again, this challenge is on the same par as vehicles, but we don't really talk about it with the same gusto that we do with cars, certainly not in this country. The problem with cows is primarily one of methane. And again, the challenge here is that cows have been hired to do a specific job. They convert grass into meat. But they're using the world's most marginal land, and it's actually very difficult to digest grasses and scrub land. And the technology, the way the cows have evolved to do this is that they have 5 stomachs, famously, right? They're using, there's no oxygen in the center of this digestive process. They're using an anaerobic fermentation that creates hydrogen as a side product inside the cow. And that chemical fermentation reaction is actually reversible. So if you have a lot of hydrogen building up inside the cow, that fermentation process slows down and the cows stop digesting. And the solution is for the cows and the microbes inside of the cows to convert that hydrogen to methane, which is then exhaled by the cow so that they can digest at reasonable rates. And all of this chemistry is to say that methane is a feature. And if you want to raise animals on this scrub, on this marginal land that can't really be used for raising any other agricultural products, for example, because it doesn't have enough rain, you have to rely on a ruminant. You have to create the optimized biological solution, which ends up emitting methane. And so the idea that we're going to somehow try to engineer a cow to get rid of methane misses the point, which is that methane is a feature, right? So if we are going to try to solve this problem of ruminants exhaling methane, we need to look at other areas for solution. And we really need a solution because the growth in meat consumption continues in countries as they develop. So if you look at the history of South Korea, they increased their beef consumption as they became richer and richer. In China, we see China's growing middle class is also increasing its beef consumption. And globally, beef consumption is set to rise about 40% by 2050, right? Which is to say that we have a problem. And so the question becomes, how do I meet our climate targets in the face of this problem? If we electrify transport, and if we end up being able to move to renewable energy for electricity generation, we still have this problem, this growing problem of agriculture, which is again, primarily a problem with cows. And Greenpeace has in 2018 estimated that we needed to cut our meat consumption 80% if we are to meet our climate targets. And again, primarily, we really are talking about cutting our consumption of beef, right? So how do you solve this problem, right? Historically, the solution has been to try to yell at people, right? And so we try to convince people to become vegetarian, but generally speaking, it hasn't worked. The number of vegetarians has not increased at all in the US in the last 20 years. And you can make the argument that maybe the global warming crisis, the climate crisis, will cause a change there, but you'd be hard pressed to say there's any historical evidence for it. Whereas when we look at other aspects of climate change, we're actually having tremendous success in electrifying, in changing the electrical grid from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And we're starting to have success changing transport into something that's clean. And we're having that success because of technological innovation. And so the natural question to ask is, can innovation be applied to cows, right? Is it possible to innovate our way out of this mess? Now, of course, innovation exists in farms already, right? People have been making cows better primarily through breeding for generations. So this is a plot of the number of pounds of milk created by a cow as a function of year. And you can see during the period of World War II, you had about 5,000 pounds of milk per cow. Today, it is almost 5 times as much. It's about 25,000 of milk per cow. And you'll notice that there's no saturation in this curve. We haven't hit a biological limit, right? Evolution has optimized cows for things other than milk production. And so when we decide that we can protect cows from the environment and breed them specifically for milk, we're actually pretty successful. Not only has the average cow increased dramatically, the record-setting cows have also increased. So this is Gigi. She was the record milk producer in 2016. Gigi put out 75,000 pounds of milk. And again, the record producing cow has not saturated. In fact, the limit to cow productivity right now seems to be that as cows have gotten this large, you literally start to have trouble getting them underneath overpasses on the freeway. So this has actually been a boon to the environment. If you look, you can see that by making these gigantic cows 5 times larger than they used to be, they're emitting twice as much carbon dioxide per cow, but they're emitting 1/3 less CO2 per kilogram of milk, right? There's an overhead that has to be paid to make the animal function. But once that overhead is paid, it actually doesn't increase dramatically as you make the cow bigger. So this incremental innovation has actually been pretty successful in the dairy industry. And if we only had to consider dairy, we might say that we really don't need to do much more than try to accelerate these kinds of trends. You know, we could start to make the cows the size of stadiums, perhaps, and everything will be okay. But actually, if you start to consider beef, you start to see that there's actually a real problem in trying to do this for meat, because while evolution had not previously optimized cows to produce more milk, it has optimized cows to produce more cow. And there has been no success whatsoever in improving the feed efficiency for beef in the last century. Now, if you look carefully on this graph, you can actually see there's been an improvement for chickens. Chickens used to be able to fly, but again, by protecting them from their environment, we can give them these ginormous breasts, which undermine their ability to take care of themselves. But if we're taking care of them, we can improve their efficiency. And you'll see on this graph again that chickens are remarkably efficient producers of protein. And we'll come back to that story in just a little bit. The important point is that incremental innovation is not giving us almost any improvement in cattle efficiency, and certainly not the kind of improvement that we need to not just stabilize our emissions, but make them smaller. And so we turn to this idea that we have to disrupt the cow, which is a strange statement to make, right? Again, I want to encourage us to look at cows as a technology. One of the reasons I chose this topic is because it really makes you think about what a technology is in the first place when you look at it through the eyes of a cow. But before we talk about how it is that we might disrupt a cow, let's talk about what this word disruption means in the first place. And to do that, I want to put meat aside for a moment and talk about an industry that we know has been disrupted, which is the taxi industry. So all of us can agree that cabs have been disrupted. The ride-hailing industry is roughly tenfold larger than the taxi industry at this point. And clearly some new technology came out and something changed. But the question is exactly what? When the media throws around this term disruption, they tend to not do it with any meaning. So they talk about a technology getting better, and that somehow embodying disruption. But of course, as we saw from Gigi, a technology can improve fivefold, and that hasn't fundamentally disrupted anything. So there's more than just technology that goes into disruption. And the missing piece from this conversation is, of course, cash, right? When we talk about the taxi industry disrupted, what we really mean is that somebody took their cash. They used new technology to take the cash. But ultimately, the disruption itself is a function of cash flows. And once we understand that what's happening with disruptive innovation is that the cash flows are changing, we can start to use an analytical framework to look at this. The analytical framework, now I use more than one analytical framework in the work on innovation, but the one that I want to use for disruption is one that was invented by a friend of mine, Glenn Eaton's, when he was in the venture capital world. And Glenn's insight was that we can take a cash flow map and we can trace the flow of information, of cash, and of goods and services. And when we change that flow, then we can use these maps in order to see what's changed. So if we start with a taxi service, in yellow is the flow of information. I want to call a cab, and so I call dispatch, and then dispatch radios the driver. The driver then brings the car to me, that's the pink arrow, and I pay the driver cash, that's the green. The driver then moves that cash to the taxi administration, who uses it in order to pay for the fleet, right? This is the taxi service as it was for the century before around 2008. But once we started to put iPhones into our pockets, once we had a new technology which had our location and could communicate, right? We no longer needed the dispatcher. The taxi industry didn't understand that dispatch was the moat that kept everybody inside the industry. And as soon as you could radio your location through your cell phone, now you could connect directly to an automated dispatcher who would then automatically route a driver, the ideal driver, to us. And the resulting solution was faster. We waited less time because the entire process was automated. It is better. We can see the cars approaching as we wait. And it is cheaper as well. Even when you've gotten rid of some of the venture capital subsidies, it still is overall a better solution on almost every respect. So unless you are in Manhattan, which is covered with cabs, generally speaking, you're using ride hailing today. Now, we need to take this question and say, okay, if what we're talking about is diverting money. We're talking about changing cash flows. How might this apply back to meat? What will disruption look like in the animal meat industry, right? Historically, the answer has been that disruption has looked like a chicken. And while the chicken has not completely disrupted the beef industry, it's come close. So if we take a look at beef consumption in the United States, it actually peaked in 1974 and has been declining fairly steadily ever since. It might have saturated at this point. Poultry has increased in consumption, and that's because chickens are cheap. If we go back to the slide that I showed you previously, it requires much less feed to create a pound of chicken meat than it does to create a pound of cow or pig, right? So chickens, if you will, are an inherently more efficient technology for meat production. It also takes a lot less land to create a chicken, and we'll see that as we try to map these industries. So again, if you map the beef industry, the money starts with the customer and moves to the grocer, which moves to this consolidated wholesale and slaughter operation. There are only 3 large meat packers in the country right now, and that operation has consolidated as a result with scale, but they can't consolidate the feedlot, which is much larger, and they can't consolidate the operation of taking that cow from a cow-calf operation, which works from birth to weaning, with the cow-calf operation sells to the yearling operation, which raises the cow further on grass until it's brought to that feedlot. This is the cheapest way to raise a cow today because the land is cheap. The cows eat grass, which is almost free. But obviously this industry can't be scaled very easy or consolidated. That is different in the poultry industry. In the poultry industry, you have the unit is the chicken. You no longer have to have it roam free and take itself to find the nearest patch of grass. The food can be brought to the chicken. The chicken can be stacked up like in an apartment complex. And ultimately, the technology is not just more efficient, it's also more scalable. So you have this consolidation in the industry. And all of those things factor into making the chicken cheaper. And so the chicken has taken the low end of the meat market away from cattle, right? But the chicken isn't better. The chicken isn't faster. We haven't won on all attributes. And so as a result, the cattle market is still substantial. And we still have this problem that 10% of global emissions go through cows, right? So as a result, the environmentalists in Silicon Valley have decided to try to tackle the cow from the top end of the market. And they have invested in meat alternatives. And so the next question to ask is, are meat alternatives disruptive? Right. Now, meat alternatives are unquestionably better for the planet than beef when measured, at least in terms of carbon dioxide, even though there's an incredible amount of processing that goes on. The total CO2 footprint of an Impossible Burger is far less than that of beef. And what the industry looks like on one of these cash flow maps, again, the right side is the same. You're still working through the groceries and the restaurants. You're still going through a wholesaler, but you have a much more complicated supply chain on the left side. The protein for the alternative meat comes from peas, and you have to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in capital to separate that protein from the fiber, to deliver a neutral flavor before it can be mixed by Beyond into a patty, right? The processing of this technology, I've only used a few boxes here. I've only used a few boxes elsewhere. I obviously, there's more complexity that I'm not going to fit very easily onto a screen for all of these. I'm just trying to hit the highlights, but the processing shouldn't be underestimated, right? A technology like tofu, right? There are 16 pieces of processing equipment to create a tofu block, right? So all of this requires capital, and as a result, meat alternatives are more expensive than beef, right? So again, they may be better from a carbon footprint, but not necessarily cheaper. And this is borne out if you go to shop at King Soopers. So I pulled all of this data from Instacart. This is what the prices are locally. And you can see the plant-based proteins are in red and the animal protein is in brown. And you can see the Impossible Burger is more than twice the price of the competing beef, right? Both of them are about 20% fat, right? It is great that Impossible exists, but right now it's a luxury good, right? It is the province of the rich, and this is not a global solution if Impossible is at this price, right? This is, of course, due to the cost of production, but it's not going to be this expensive to produce forever. This data came from the Beyond Burgers S1 when they revealed their economics when they went public. At that point, they were making about 20 million pounds of meat alternative per year, right? Which is a rounding error on the scale of what they could do. And as they scale, costs come down, right? And there's actually a rule of thumb that you can use. As you scale by a factor of 10, costs cut in half for a technology that's made in a vat. And that's true for food, that's true for pharmaceuticals, that's true if you are mixing electrodes for battery applications. And we can use this rule of thumb to estimate whether or not plant burgers can match the cost of beef. And the answer is, if you have 1,000 times more production than today, then maybe you start to approach and get below that price of beef. Maybe you can win on price, but that's cost. That's not price, right? And it's a weird thing about the beef industry, that the beef industry is a commodity, right? Nobody is making money in the beef industry. Nobody is making a profit. In fact, many of them continually make losses, as they will tell you at length, right? Whereas if you are making a consumer product, you are expected to make a profit. Somebody has to invest in that capital equipment. They can just as easily put their money into Twitter. Why would they want to put their money into beef alternative if it is not profitable? And so once you take the typical 60% gross margin for a consumer food product that is branded, something like Coca-Cola or Thomas's English Muffins, then you start to recognize that actually you may never reach parity. At best, you're going to be close. And you can do this analysis from the bottom up as well. In the world of tofu in the United States, about 2.6% of the cost of tofu is actually the soybeans, right? And if you apply similar economics now, you'll find that the Beyond Burger, even if it were as simple as tofu, would still be more expensive than beef, right? Again, this shows up in dairy alternatives as well. Almond milk is more expensive than dairy milk, even though it has a decent market share. And some of this is due to subsidy, but even if you take half of that difference, even if you add $1 per two quart container in subsidy, almond milk is still not that close, right? So at the end of the day, you have chicken, which is able to capture the bottom of the market, and meat alternatives, which are able to capture the top of the market. And we're still shy of disruption. So the question then is that the end, right? Or is there another path? And how should you think about whether or not there's another path? And I'm going to point out how you would think about it from the perspective of the mapping. But I think what is better to do is to tell a story not of what can happen, but also to look to history to see what's already happened. And there already is a meat that has been disrupted before. We've just forgot about it. And that meat is veal. So if you are of a certain age, you might remember getting veal served as a kid. But today, we consume less than 1% of the amount of veal as there was consumed in the 1950s, right? 1%. Veal has been utterly and completely disrupted more than the taxi industry, and nobody thinks about it. And I'm going to pause. This is weird, right? This is weird because we don't have a definition of disruption. This isn't studied academically. You can't find this in the literature, and the industry, for various reasons, isn't that interested either. But veal disappeared, and I'll pause. Like, you know, since I can see folks, does anybody want to guess as to what killed veal?
PETA?
Well, that's not a bad guess. In the 1980s, there was a boycott movement, right? And people for the ethical treatment of animals and other organizations absolutely went after veal because veal is baby cows, right? And so you would rip these cows from their mothers before they were weaned, and you would put them into boxes where they literally couldn't turn around because if they moved, their meat became less tender. And people considered that a little horrifying. Although it's the stories are, as all with all of this, the story ends up being more complicated as you dig into more details. But yeah, there was a problem. There was a huge marketing campaign against veal. But by that,
here's another one. Here's another one. The 1950s and 60s, when you started to see the decline, was also the rise of the fast food companies like McDonald's and Burger King, and they probably were buying beef and not veal.
They were absolutely buying beef and not veal, but more important than what they were buying is what we were not doing, right? If you think about what happened in the 1950s, we had the rise of fast food, we had the rise of frozen dinners, we changed our culture substantially. We had television, we had cars, and what really happened was that we forgot how to cook. Right? It used to be that the average home cook knew 20 recipes. And today, if you cook at all, the average home cook knows 5. The average recipe today contains 40% of the ingredients as the average recipe from decades ago. We stopped cooking. The thing that disrupted veal was not a veal alternative. The thing that disrupted veal was we put our attention elsewhere, right? And amazingly, the exact same thing has happened to steak. So that entire decline that I showed you of steak peaking in the 1970s, of beef peaking in the 1970s, all of that was people stopping cooking steak. Now people will get steak at a restaurant, but they rarely do it at home. We've forgotten how to cook it. Veal is a little bit more expensive than other meats, and so it was one of the first to go. Steak, we don't want to ruin a steak because we don't know what to do, and so we tend to not do it at all, right? Ultimately, this leads to a conclusion. If you want to disrupt, we can do this through the supply side, but history teaches us that it's actually more powerful to do it through demand. And so on these maps, what we can do is we can target at the demand side. And just as with Uber, we can ask ourselves, what happens if we intercede between the consumer and the grocer, right? What happens if we insert an ad? Can we divert the cash? Can we move it to some ghost kitchen? Can we move it to HelloFresh? What happens when we are no longer making the decisions to buy ingredients? What happens when we are no longer thinking about assembling the components of dinner, but when we are asking for dinner itself? What happens when we attack food not from a perspective of the ingredient, but from the perspective of diet, right? And we don't know what's going to happen, but there's no question that this is underway, and that the biggest disruptor may not be Beyond, although they are important to have, but it may be Instacart or Noom or the next app that we use in order to decide what to eat, when we can set goals for ourselves based on health, based on cost, based on the environment, when we no longer think about putting things together. Because if you think about it, there are very few other aspects of our lives where consumers build the product themselves. This has been the trend since the 1950s, and there's no reason to expect it not to continue. So this is what looking at these from an analytical framework will do. It'll take you to surprising places. If I just looked at the map itself, I can actually go through each square on that map, go through each arrow and ask, what happens if I make a change here? Can we see disruption? These cash flow maps end up becoming a tool for planning. And so you can imagine if we go through and we ask ourselves, what could change with the land, right? Well, if we had another use for the land, then that would raise the price of the land. Right now, again, the whole reason cows exist is to convert grass into money, right? So if we can pay farmers to convert grass into energy, to convert grass into agricultural products instead of into meat, the farmers are going to appreciate it. And whereas disrupting meat is going to be politically unpopular, and that's one reason why we hesitate to do it, if we look at these maps and decide that we can attack the land, then we end up with a very different solution. You can also use these maps in order to evaluate ideas that come out. So this is what taxing methane might look like on here. And you can see immediately that if we insert a tax on pollution with each transaction, a tax on carbon, right? What we're doing is we're making the cow operation more expensive, right? And a natural consequence of this might be to consolidate it. It is possible to raise cattle entirely on a feedlot. They pollute less because if the cow never sees grass, you can fatten it up to market weight in 18 months. Whereas if you graze it, it will take a couple years. If you raise it entirely on grass, it will take 6 or 7. And during that time, it's exhaling, which means it's emitting methane, right? So it turns out the environmentally friendlier thing to do is to try to raise cows the way we raise chickens. There are all sorts of consequences that we have to ask ourselves that is this what we want? But again, putting these things onto a map lets us see. Of course, if we do nothing, there are consequences there as well. We can model climate change as a decrease in the productivity of the land, which will, of course, increase the price of beef downstream as well. It'll give us the consequence that the rangers don't want by inaction just as easily as by action. The important point that I wanted to, the story that I want to tell is that we have tools. We can make a map of what the future will look like. We can use this to predict. And if we want to, we can use this to try to design. So I want to thank you guys for your attention. And I want to do a shout out to Glenn Edens, who developed this methodology for cash flow analysis. If you have any questions, let's chat.
I want you to teach us how to do those Glenn Edens maps. They're really cool, but I could not, if you asked me to do one this afternoon, I would be unable. So that's read the paper and.
Yeah, so sadly, there's no paper, but I can, I can supply some items. I'll show you that, there is a framework here that I didn't want to go into because, as you said, you're just gonna, it'll roll right out of your brain as soon as it rolls in. But there's only a few operations that you can reasonably do in one of these maps. You can replace a box, you can consolidate the box, right? Consolidating would be, Netflix is getting into both content creation and distribution, right? You can put in and insert a step in the middle, whether that's a tax or whether it's an app. And then once you've done that, you have the chance to divert things as well. This is pretty much it, right? So it's not that hard to teach, and we can have a separate conversation. There are also a lot more details about the global agricultural system. I did do some simplifying here in order to be able to tell a coherent narrative. But, all of these things go, the web of interlocking cash flows is quite amazing, right? So that, you have the milk industry creates cheese and has to get rid of whey. And as a result, whey ends up in paint products, right? It's quite remarkable, the cleverness with which we use both the product and the waste.
Seth, when you showed that first slide with the histogram of who is producing CO2 or methane, transportation and cows, agriculture turned out to be the same, which led me to the ridiculous idea that we should combine the two and ride cows to work.
Transportation.
And immediately half the problem.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine how we're going to fit them into our apartment complexes in cities, but it could be fun to try.
Well, I went the other direction. So you're doing the analogy of the ride hailing, right? So production of the car and whatever insurance, that's all day, you're not disrupting that, but you're disrupting the dispatchers one. So I'm thinking, okay, so now if I don't order food with the meat, can I order the middle? And what would that be? Could that be a machine that take all the ingredients? And so I just need a 3D printer at home to print my own meat. So I don't have to order the cow.
Yes.
But maybe that's cow, that's come from any other things.
I mean,
So you don't have to, right?
The challenge that we have in the food system is that the food system has perfect product market fit, right? It's not like we're going to do better in achieving, customer satisfaction than the things that were evolved to like. And so the idea of trying to disrupt food has to be looked at very differently from the idea of trying to disrupt anything else, which is not to say that it can't be done, as we saw with veal. And I think that realistically, although many of us will mourn the passing of cooking, it sort of seems inevitable, right? I like cooking. I like shopping at the grocery store. I like going and picking things out. But I can't see, as cooking continues to see competition from every other aspect of our lives, and all of those other opportunities have a better shot at our time now that we have constant connectivity. It's hard to imagine how cooking will sustain, right?
So we can all have astronauts food, right? So these things you squeeze
Yeah.
out of things, and maybe the agricultural would change.
Right. Well, one of the things that I didn't harp on here, and I'll have to go through quite a few slides to get back to the beginning, is no, let's go for this one. You'll notice that chickens are more efficient than plant-based protein, which is something that kind of gets lost in the conversation. But chickens have a lower impact than plant-based protein on the environment. And if I go to the cost slide, chickens are also incredibly inexpensive, right? And part of the reason is that chickens are a commodity, and commodities have very little profitability. They also tend to have very large scale. And if you would like a crazy fact, again, I'm going to go to my extra slides here. This is going to be small print. This is this is a table of the farm share, and everybody's going to have to get their heads close to the screen, I'm afraid, to see this. So this represents the percent of retail price that goes to the farm, right? So you can see that beef has a much higher percentage than apples, right? And that makes sense because we eat 5 times more beef by weight than we do with apples. And so you can imagine that there's less profit that has to go to each step when they on a percentage basis, when they have so much volume. But even crazier than this is that half of the cost of beef are the feed inputs, right? So literally 25% of the cost of beef is hay, right? It costs us more money to stick a label on a grapefruit and bring it to market than it does to convert grass into cow. And if you're into technology, that's kind of a daunting competitor to have to go up against, right? So if it wasn't already the case that we were at this kind of scale, then these technologies might be easier to pursue. But with poultry, beef, milk, eggs, the scale is so great. And honestly, these things are also used as loss leaders. By contrast, if you look at the bottom of this list again, 2.5% of the cost of tofu goes back into the beans, and that's going to be low. That'll be a higher number in Japan. But even if you look at bread, right, which is again a fairly undifferentiated product in the supermarket, you're losing 25x. You're 25x higher than your unit costs.
Did I understand you, Seth, to say that the beef producers are making a loss?
A lot of them are. I mean, obviously, look, they try to be profitable. So in a given year, they have thin margins, but very thin margins, and they make their money on volume.
So they are making a profit, but just not much.
They're making it a small percentage, right? So if the average American eats 56 pounds of beef a year, right? Now you have the opportunity. You don't need much of that in order to be able to sustain a profit as a whole. And so even though we've consolidated down to just 3 meat packers, their margins are actually pretty slim.
So if they started making a loss, then they'd go out of business and they'd stop producing beef.
Yeah, right. Well, what ends up happening is the costs end up being passed up, right? So they will charge what they need to charge. The supply of beef is dictated by land and weather, right? And so beef prices will fluctuate as a result of climate.
If you took out farm subsidies for beef farmers, would they go out of business?
Well, a lot of them, yeah.
So, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is that some of this is driven by policy, and you didn't really talk much about policy.
No, I didn't. Right. So the price is to the extent that the price is subsidized, right, that enables the marginal producer to be able to be profitable. And as soon as that subsidy is removed, that marginal producer would have to go do something else. And it may be that yeah.
Isn't that a strategy then to move people off of beef?
Absolutely. I mean, we can get rid of the subsidies. And right now, I'm trying to remember. I don't remember what the subsidies are off the top of my head for beef. I mean, if you take a look at the lease cost for land in Montana, for example, they'll charge a per head for cost per cattle, which is below market, right? And so that's how you can have all of this Bureau of Land Management land that gets ranched on. And that is an effective subsidy by having a low cost for that land, below market cost for that land, right? So the United States would then get a little bit more money, and that would come out of the consumer pockets, right? As we're seeing, that's politically hard. It's politically hard to see people raise prices on a staple.
Mhm.
Seth?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
I was just going to say that I would argue that, if these things tend not to change for a reason, right? So, we can absolutely, if we had the political power to do so, we can enforce that. But is that a realistic goal, or is inventing a new cow more realistic, honestly? Right, Jill, go ahead.
Are cows more efficient at turning vegetation into meat than humans are? Like,
So, yeah.
one of the things I see grapefruits and potatoes, but what about peas? Like, can we just eat the peas to get that protein if Noom convinces us that that's better?
Yeah, we absolutely can. I mean, part of the joy of, I'll go back to, I didn't know how to, for a second, here it is. I didn't know how to make this slide exactly because I have a box that says literally anything else in the universe. And if I don't know how to make a lentil dish, but I can get a pre-prepared lentil dish, and it is cheaper and better for me and better for the planet than the beef dish, then yes, right? And if we go back up again, we can see that the footprint of tofu is lower.
That's what I'm curious about, the footprint of just a plant-based diet without the processing.
The footprint of the plant-based diet is obviously better without the processing. Again, cooking it ourselves does require some processing. And I would argue that preparing it at scale is probably going to end up being cheaper and gentler on the planet than expecting us to prepare it on our own. But this quickly devolves into cultural aspects, as well as health aspects, as well as environmental aspects, and then economic aspects, right? We have to hit all of these layers, right? Oh yeah, and by the way, it's got to taste good.
Right.
Right.
Which usually goes against health. Like, add some salt, add some sugar.
this is an area that is obviously being innovated on from outside the meat industry. The livestock industry spends less than 0.1% of its revenue on R&D, right? And now if you compare that to a company like Pfizer, might be 12%, Intel probably 10%, right? So, you know, almost no research is going into the cow, in part because the cow is already pretty optimized. But there's a lot of money that can be applied towards this, and you know, there's a lot of gain to be made. Maybe we can make things that are just uniformly tastier over time, and we can make the lentil just more palatable, right? That's sort of what a plant burger is about. All right.
I had a question. I'm curious why the decline of veal, why beef and chicken and everything, you haven't seen sort of a cascade in terms of maybe seen by cost, beef followed then maybe by chicken or even eggs. I don't know, but I feel like they're still up there and they haven't dropped so precipitously as the veal did in your graph.
Now, nothing has dropped precipitously as veal, but if we like rack our brains, we can like remember that there are these weird phrases like mutton that we no longer use, Cornish game hens, pheasant. I mean, these are things that people used to eat and we don't. And so we've reduced to hamburgers and pasta and scrambled eggs. And we all sort of have the ability to make those things. People will be able to still, some people can still make chicken breast and chicken thighs.
I suppose to your point, lamb used to be pretty popular when I was growing up, and that's more a delicacy or not cooked as much. It definitely requires more skill than, say, grounding some ground beef.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily more skill, but more practice, I would say. Right? All of these things require practice. In order to be able to cook a hamburger, to get it to medium rare, you need to practice. You have to have the flame at the right temperature and the burger at the right thickness. And that's all intimidating when you've never seen it done before. And so people don't, right? So, I mean, so my argument would be that, there's the 5 recipes that we still have. Maybe between all of us, it's 10. But there's the other recipes that we've forgotten, which represents a surprising amount that we just never think about because we forgot it.
I'm trying to extrapolate. So if the cause of this rapid decline in the consumption of various foods is due to the great forgetting,
Right.
Doesn't this apply to other industries as well? And so is the cost of innovation forgetting? That is, because we're becoming less knowledgeable and less skilled and less expert, is that across all domains? And so we'll get technical innovation at the cost of our own abilities? I mean, is there some weird relationship there?
I mean, there sort of has to be, yes. I mean, how many people do you know who can do logarithms in their heads? Can do logs, right? What's quick? What's the log of 70, right? I mean, there used to be people who could do that. There are still a couple, but so it's a great question. And I would say that obviously for some things we see a fragmentation, right? Where skills are maintained by a devoted few. So there are a few people who can do analog photography and can burn in an image, right? But for most of us, no, we've forgotten how to burn in a negative, right?
Or even driving a stick shift.
Or driving a stick shift, yeah.
All right, we're getting shut down by our people who want to live in this room. I need to get off of here and get out of this room. I want to follow up because I'm not interested in the meat industry particularly, but it's a great example and I'd love to understand how to apply it to other examples.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy. I've applied this to construction and to other things where I'm not allowed to speak as freely. So I'd happy to chat more with anybody. Thanks very much for your time, everyone.
That's pretty good. Thank you.
All right. I'll stick around for a few moments if anybody has another question, but everyone else, please leave.